This video will discuss interest groups and the mass media in preparation for the AP government exam. Interest groups are active participants in the political scene lobbying for certain causes. Interest groups and political parties are similar because they both are organizations that exist outside of the structure of government, but they interact with the government in such a way that it is impossible to separate them. However, they are different because although both support candidates, interest groups don't run their own candidates for office positions like political parties do. Also, parties support a large variety of issues, while interest groups are targeted to one or maybe two specific issues at most. There are three types of theories of interest groups that you should know: elitist theory, pluralist theory, and hyperpluralist theory. Elitist theory says that a few select interest groups have all the power. Pluralist theory says that there are so many different interest groups that it's impossible for any one group to dominate. And lastly, hyperpluralist theory says that too many groups influence political process and it results in chaos and contradiction among government policies. There are two types of interest groups: institutional group and a membership group. A membership group is also called an individual group. Institutional interest groups are individuals or organizations representing other organizations like General Motors. Membership interest groups are made up of Americans who join because they feel strongly on an issue. However, people don't just join membership interest groups, they usually have an incentive to join. Solidarity incentives is the sense of companionship that arises out of meeting in small groups. Material incentives include money or things, services that lure members into joining. And lastly, purposive incentives are based on an ideal of accomplishment. A public interest group benefits those who aren't even members of it. Membership interest groups have a lot rougher of a time getting funds than institutional interest groups do. The Sierra Club is an environmentalist interest group. The NAACP and National Organization of Women are examples of equality interest groups, and General Motors is an example of a business interest group. And lastly, the American Bar Association is an example of a professional interest group. The term Dirty Dozen is important because it often appears on the multiple choice section of the AP government exam. Just remember that the term Dirty Dozen refers to 12 representatives who voted against the Environmental Protection Bill. Interest groups get their funding from foundation grants. So basically donations from rich families like Rockefeller family and the Ford Foundation. They donate to interest groups, which makes up the foundation grants. They also get funding from federal grants and from direct solicitation. Usually a teaser with a person's name or a sad picture is on the front envelope to persuade people to actually open the envelope during the direct solicitation attempts. Also, a lot of people believe that a constant revolving door of politicians taking lucrative jobs in the private sector after they helped interest groups will lead to the suffering of public interest. And it's also an example of absolute corrupt government. So that covers my topic on interest groups. Now we'll move on to the mass media. The media functions are important, and the media functions as entertainment, news reports, agenda setting, and creation of political forums. When I say agenda setting, I mean that it picks what issues are important and should get exposure and which issues shouldn't. In America, the media has much greater freedoms than it does in other countries. The media can provide exposure for a political candidate, but it also can ruin that same candidate. The politicians try to use the media for their own gain, but remember, the media itself also uses politicians for their own gain because they need ratings. Thus, they have a really odd relationship in which they don't trust each other, but both need each other. The Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, sets the rules for the media. The FCC prohibits people from operating more than one newspaper, radio station, or TV station in a given market. The FCC also says that a company can't own more than 12 radio stations, TV stations, and newspapers in the country. The national press can be the gatekeeper, scorekeeper, and a watchdog. When I say gatekeeper, I mean that it decides which topics and stories get attention. When I say scorekeeper, I mean that it keeps track of and helps to establish a national reputation. And when I say watchdog, I mean that it exposes scandals and corruption. Newspapers have much more freedom than the TV does, which is actually really ironic because newspapers have less competition and are thus much more easily able to influence, while TV has a lot of competition. The electronic media has been criticized for forcing political figures to conform to sound bites. Sound bites are basically comments compressed to several seconds, and often sound bites can be misleading. Radio and TV stations are regulated by rules like the equal time rule, the right of reply rule, and the fairness doctrine. The equal time rule says that if a station sells time to one candidate, it has to be willing to sell time to another candidate as well. The right of reply rule says that if a person is attacked on a broadcast program, he can reply on that same program. And there used to be a fairness doctrine where broadcasters had to discuss both sides of a controversial issue. However, in 1987, the FCC abolished that rule because it inhibited the free discussion of issues. However, today many broadcasters still choose to follow it voluntarily. Local newspapers are generally more Republican than Democratic, while national newspapers tend to be slightly more Democratic. The White House Press Corps is basically a group of men and women who are closest to the president. They are always there with the president whenever something newsworthy happens. Usually, presidents were the ones who received a lot of exposure. However, in 1979, C-SPAN provided coverage of House events, but the Senate has used TV much more fully by allowing many events to be broadcast for live TV or for videos. This media coverage helps senators get nominated for the presidency. And lastly, a spin doctor is a person who tries to influence journalists with their interpretations of events.